All right. I think we are live. For anyone watching this, you are free to ask questions and I will get them in the live chat and I'll be able to ask them to Sarah in just a little bit here. Otherwise, I'm just going to pretend there's nobody out here and move on with everything I had scheduled. So thank you so much for joining in. Sarah McCammon is a politics reporter for NPR and someone who grew up in the world of evangelical Christianity. She was taught to fear God, obey him, and not question the faith. She believed her gay grandfather and her Muslim friend were hellbound unless they accepted Jesus and changed their ways. And then she began covering Donald Trump, and she witnessed firsthand the power and influence that evangelical Christian beliefs held on the right. Sarah is no longer an evangelical Christian, even if she is a believer. She has since left that fold, and she is not alone. Her new book is all about people just like her, a child of evangelicalism who grew up and walked away and who now have to deconstruct everything they were taught as children. It's called the Exvangelicals, Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. And with that, let me bring Sarah in here. Sarah, hello. How are you? I'm going to unmute you, so I'm going to try that again. There we go.
Oh, I just said I'm good, and thank you for having me.
Sure. Did I get all of that right? And how would you introduce yourself when you're talking to people?
Yeah, I mean, more or less, I think one thing I want to be clear about is that my own sort of journey with my faith and away from an evangelical identity happened long before I covered the Trump campaign. But in the course of covering the 2016 campaign in particular, I, like many other journalists, found myself doing a lot of stories about white evangelicals. And, the big question I think a lot of people had and often still have is first, would evangelicals support someone like Donald Trump? And then why have they continued to? And I'm a journalist, right? So usually we keep ourselves out of the story. And I had spent a lot of years in mainstream journalism. I had my own kind of quiet and often kind of painful departure from the evangelical world over a lot of things, like you mentioned, the treatment of LGBTQ people and other issues that just made me feel like that identity was not right for me. But then I found myself covering this movement that I'd really grown up in. And I was thinking about the way that the people I'd grown up around had talked about politics, had talked about morality and character. And so it was fascinating to, so many years later, sort of find my personal and professional life running kind of headlong into each other. And I spent quite a few years thinking about, what I might want to say about that. And the book is really the product of that thought process, as well as encountering other people in the course of some of my reporting who, for various reasons, some of them catalyzed by the Trump moment and others for other reasons, felt that their evangelical label no longer worked for them.
I want to talk about a lot of that, especially the Trump era and the mixture, the Christian nationalism of it all. I'll get to that. Before we start with that, let me go back to your childhood here, just so people have an idea of the environment in which you grew up in. Tell me about how like Jesus-y your childhood was, because one thing you wrote in the book is your parents wholeheartedly embraced the teachings of people like James Dobson, for example.
Right. And, for me, I think as I got older, my process, it was really about kind of widening the lens and slowly coming to realize that there is a bigger world out there. But for me, so much of my world was shaped by a very specific evangelical subculture, which at the time was just the air I breathed. But looking back, this was the 1980s and 90s. Evangelicalism was really kind of a growing movement with growing political influence. People like James Dobson, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, Ralph Reed, lots of others sort of dominated the headlines. And also they and many others were sort of building this evangelical subculture and kind of intellectual infrastructure that for me was my whole world. My pretty much my whole universe was Christian school, church, Christian books, magazines, Christian broadcasting, Christian radio. We had, basically for anything that the quote unquote secular world could offer, there was an alternative. And some of that was, frankly, some of that was just about providing maybe more wholesome entertainment for kids. But some of it was also about a very profound counter narrative. The textbooks that I had in my Christian school promoted this idea of a Christian nation that was falling away from God, which is, an idea that we hear from Donald Trump all the time today. And they also promoted a vision of the world that, a literal view of the Bible, 6 to 10,000 year old earth, these kinds of things, young earth creationism. And that was really all I knew. I didn't know that there was another way to be Christian, which obviously the Christian worldview is much bigger than that. And I didn't know very many people who didn't believe what we believed.
Which publisher were those textbooks? I'm trying to get a flavor of what brand of like fundamentalist Christian books those were. Are we talking like A. Becca, Bob Jones?
Precisely, yeah, both of those. And
Okay.
this is something I talk about a lot. Like, I guess demographers and sociologists sometimes like to parse, what's the line between fundamentalist and evangelical? And it's a relevant question. And certainly there's a spectrum. And, something I say is this is my childhood. Everyone's a little bit different. Some people, there are degrees, I guess, of almost anything. But in my experience, and I think in the experience of a lot of evangelical kids of my generation, the line between fundamentalist and evangelical is very indistinct. It was really more, it was blurred
And
because those kinds of textbooks, had really wide influence. And groups like Bill Gothard's group, that was profiled in the Shiny Happy People documentary, most evangelicals weren't involved in that. And that was definitely more fundamentalist. But his ideas had a profound influence on a lot of evangelical churches. And so there's a lot of cross-pollination and overlap that happens either explicitly or implicitly.
you mentioned having like the Christian versions of so many things in secular culture. At what point did you realize this was kind of an alternative Christian universe and not what like everyone experiences? I think you mentioned you weren't even allowed to watch shows I would consider wholesome, like the Smurfs or
Right.
something. So, like,
Right.
at what point do you realize, no, I'm in a special bubble here and it's not what everyone's experiencing?
I mean, I knew it on some level as a child because, I knew that there were public schools and I knew that there were people that we needed to reach because they were lost, as we put it. They didn't believe like we believed. But I didn't know, for example, that like the Catholic Church had been fine with evolution for a really long time, which a lot of people, wouldn't probably think of the Catholic Church as a bastion of progressivism, at least not at that time. But that was like the whole other world that was sort of off limits to me. Even that, I knew, I knew that I was being sort of protected from the world, and I think that was framed as a good thing and a positive thing. And to be fair, right, like every parent has to protect their children to some extent because there is danger in the world and there are bad people that want to do bad things, and children need guidance and protection. And so I don't mean to fault that in and of itself, but my particular view of the world was pretty constrained. There were a lot of limits on what I could watch and, what I could read or movies I could see. And so there were things I just, wasn't familiar with. I think as I got older, some of it was little things would happen that would sort of, I guess, create sort of cracks in that foundation. One of the things I talk about in the book is my grandfather, who was one of, very few people I knew well, who was outside of the evangelical world and wasn't religious at all. And just the great concern we had for him, particularly because of his sexuality, because he came out as gay during my childhood, which created, additional sort of tension with my family. And so, meeting people, occasionally I would meet people. There's a story about going to the skating rink and meeting another little girl who went to public school and trying to quote unquote witness to her because I believed that she was going to go to hell if I didn't witness to her. And so it was just kind of slowly through a lot of encounters with the outside world in a way. And just through sort of thinking about things, I began to wonder why, most museums we went to talked about dinosaurs being millions of years old, that kind of thing. I got the sense gradually that we just, not only that we were different from other people, but that maybe most of the world saw things differently than we did.
I think there was one story you mentioned about actually doing some reporting on a fossil that was however many thousands or millions of years old. And it's like you knew factually, or at least according to the science, it was this old, but that didn't comport with younger creationism. But again, how did you handle that situation? Because these things are coming into conflict now.
So by the time I was in my early 20s, had, I had kind of, I think the evangelical label already wasn't working for me. And when I was in my first reporting job, I did a story, and you might have heard an interview I did talking about this, but I did a story in like 2005 about when I was living in Nebraska about a fossilized mammoth. Actually, it was two mammoths that some researchers had found out in Western Nebraska, which is really dry and sandy and was, long ago an ocean. But subsequent to that, obviously, at one point, I guess there were mammoths living there, and these two Ice Age mammoths were fossilized together, with their trunks sort of locked together like twisted tree trunks, in a fight. And the story was about how this really cool fossil, which shows animal behavior, which is pretty unusual. Most fossils are just dead animals, but this was like two animals involved in a fight. It had been discovered in like the 1960s by a grad student, and it was now being moved and being displayed. And so that was really what the impetus for the story was. And I was just fascinated by this fossil and the story and what it could tell us about, the way the world had been. And just by Nebraska's rich geological history, which had had so many different kinds of, just so many different periods of different things happening in that same space. And I'd never really thought much about that because the science books that I was raised with were so limited. And I just remember when I was writing that story, the age of the fossil was about 20,000 years. And I just remember like feeling, I was comfortable at that point with the fact that the history I'd been given, the science I'd been given was not right. But it felt like almost kind of like a little guilty to type that word, 20,000 years in my script. I was probably 24 years old at this point. But I just remember thinking like, what if my parents hear this story and, what if they think I'm going to hell or have fallen away? Because, we were told the earth was at most about 10,000 years old. And so that wasn't like, it didn't force me to change my mind. I think my mind had already begun to change at that point. In part from knowing some Christian professors at my evangelical college who were honest with me about the fact that they didn't believe in young earth creationism either. But I think that was a moment where I was just kind of forced to really reckon with just how different, my upbringing had been than most people's.
I'm curious I don't know if you were familiar with the term evangelical when you were a child, but if I asked you when you were a child, what does it mean to be a Christian? Like, what are the necessary things that you have to believe? Because maybe young earth creationism is not on that list. You know too many Christians who disagree with that aspect of it. What would you have said as a child? And I'm curious what your definition would be now of what is an evangelical today?
Yeah, I don't know. Not all evangelicals are young earth creationists for sure. I think it's still a pretty dominant idea, or I'll sometimes hear people say things like, well, I don't really know. I'm not a scientist. I think there's still some skepticism of mainstream science in parts of evangelicalism. But I don't think we would have said you had to believe in young earth creationism to be a Christian. But what I heard was that the view of the Bible that was literally word for word the word of God, as it was presented, in the versions that we had, that was such an essential view. And, as I got older and studied more about how the Bible was put together, I realized there was so much I didn't know about that. But at the time, it was like, this is God, people would say this is God's love letter to us. This is our guidance for life. And so it was seen as just so central. And, I remember hearing people talk about, theistic evolution or other sort of attempts to accommodate evolutionary science with Christianity, and dismissing that idea, that the idea was that if you accept any sort of erosion of this literalistic view of scripture, everything else will fall apart, which
That's
is,
very much what like Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis has
yes.
said, which is even he, very much a creationist, young earth creationist, has said repeatedly, you don't have to believe in this, but if you deny any aspect of the book of Genesis as literal, then the whole house of cards is going to crumble.
Right, which is a really, for somebody like me who was growing up in the church, and my faith actually meant a lot to me, and I wanted to hold on to at least aspects of it, right? I wanted to hold on to the community. I wanted to hold on to the spirituality and to other things, and to be told you have to choose, I think was a very painful choice, to feel like there was no legitimate path to both, retaining a Christian identity, which I realize is not something that's important to everybody, and is not, for some evangelicals that I profiled, that is very important to them, and others it's not. But if that is something you want to do, to be told that you can't, that there is no tertium quid is very, I think, it's very painful, or it can be. And I remember, just as I got older, wrestling with that more and more and more. I just knew that our view was very fringe and was very small, and even within Christendom, it was small. And I had, I think it was actually quite brave in retrospect. One of my college professors, I think I talk about this in the book, but brought to my Christian college campus, a speaker who both had a PhD in biology and had studied evolution, and had a PhD in, I think, divinity or theology, and was an evangelical, self-described evangelical. But, he gave a talk about how he did not see that there was necessarily a conflict between faith and science. And, he put on, I'll never forget, one of the things that Ken Ham and others would say is that there are no transitional forms between fossils, that it's all made up. It's all kind of a lie. And, I heard this in a creationist seminar at my church, and I heard it at my Christian school. And this professor put up on the overhead projector a picture of a fossil that was, kind of in between, I don't remember which two animals, but he said, it's just not true. I mean, there are plenty of transitional forms. What you've been told isn't true. And so to realize that what I had suspected, which is that I'd frankly been manipulated, I think by people who believed these things sincerely. They really believed that they needed to hold on to this view of the Bible and of creationism in order to hold on to their Christian faith. But to really sort of sense that I hadn't been told the truth, for me was a pretty pivotal moment, I think.
I want to go back to the question a little bit ago, which is, when you were a kid, how would you define being a Christian? Because in my head, of the many ways you could define someone who is a Christian, I mean, you have to accept Jesus as divine, that he resurrected. Those seem pretty fundamental to what it means to be a Christian. And today, if you ask me what it means, to be an evangelical, or at least a white evangelical these days, I wonder how strong those definitions still are, because at least in practice, it doesn't feel like a belief in the gospel or a belief in the message of Jesus is central to that identity anymore. And I don't know if you, being inside that circle, see it any differently.
I mean, I would want to see data to that effect. I think most evangelicals would still say that that's central. That's what their faith is based on. And yeah, for me growing up, the central idea was that you had to believe in Jesus in order to be saved, believe that Jesus was God's son and had died and risen again to save us. we were obviously evangelicalism exists within the Protestant tradition. So we saw ourselves often as kind of opposed to Catholicism. So I grew up hearing that, we can talk directly to God. We don't need a priest. We're saved by grace, not by works. Unlike those Catholics who are so focused on their works and on, going to the priest for confession. Like, we don't need any of that. It's just us and God. And it's interesting because, this is kind of the essence of Protestantism, right? Is this independent, think for yourself, read the Bible for yourself ethos. And it's a very kind of American idea in many ways, but it also can lead, what happens when it leads you beyond that and you no longer accept all the things that most people in the tradition think are important. And so that was sort of the essence of our Christian belief, was that we needed to, whereas Catholicism or mainline Protestantism are sort of ritualistic, sacramental, liturgical, there are things you go and do to show that you are part of the faith. You're baptized, you are maybe confirmed, you participate in liturgy, you take the sacrament, you take communion, whatever it's called in a particular tradition. In evangelicalism, we had baptism and we had communion, but those were very symbolic. They were not seen as instrumental in becoming a Christian or being part of the faith. Everything was about what you think, what you believe, what you feel in your heart, what your relationship is. And so I think, as I got older, I actually found myself drawn to more, when I go to church these days, I usually go to an Episcopal church because I found myself sort of drawn to more experiential expressions of faith. I think because I often felt like as much as I tried, my head and my heart were not where I was told they were supposed to be. And so, if that's all you have, that can feel, it can feel like you're supposed to work up some kind of feeling, that I didn't always feel that I had as much as I maybe wanted to.
I want to shift gears for a bit and let's talk about Trump again, or at least that Trump phenomenon that started in 2015 and takes us to today. One of the things you wrote in the book is that for many evangelicals, the Trump phenomenon has seemed like a bright light suddenly flicked on in a dark house, exposing every crack in the foundation, every leak, every bit of detritus. I'm wondering, I absolutely agree with that, but I'm also wondering why you think it took Trump to reveal that when, from my perspective, as someone who was critical of Christianity for decades now, I feel like there was no shortage of that light, even in government for many years prior to that. I could point to things George W. Bush did that seemed to conflict with the values that evangelicals tend to espouse. But Trump seemed to put that in overdrive. The hypocrisy was so blatant. I'm wondering in your head, like, why? I don't think there was a shortage of that light before Trump. What was it about Trump that made it so obvious, at least to you, at least to many people who are covering that?
Well, again, for me, my own sort of move away from evangelicalism, a lot of it was catalyzed by my desire to include people who believe differently than I did. I had a real problem with exclusivist theology, probably starting in high school. And also, again, to include LGBTQ people like my grandfather. So for me, that wasn't what happened. But I think some of the people I talked to were more like me. Like they had sort of begun unwinding things well before this period of time. But I did talk to a lot of people for whom, whether it was Trump or maybe their church's response to the death of George Floyd, I talked to some people who felt like their churches just didn't seem to take racial justice seriously enough, or the pandemic they felt their churches didn't take the pandemic seriously enough, and particularly when it came to vulnerable people. This has been I guess what I can say is this has been a polarizing time across the board. And I think that's also true in churches. And so for some people, it has been a moment of truth and a moment of really having to kind of look in the mirror and go, who am I? What do I believe? What do I want to be part of? I also think that it's just because evangelicals have been so in the spotlight the last several years because of Trump. I think it's catalyzed more conversations about these things. And it's happening at the same time as a couple of other important trends, one of which is, well, the internet's not really a trend, but I think it has made these kinds of conversations possible in a way they wouldn't have been even 20 years ago. Not just the internet, but the rise specifically of social media and of hashtags. There are so many spaces now for conversations around specific ideas that might have been a bit niche in the past. If you were leaving church in the 90s, there were probably a few books about that, but there wasn't sort of like an organized place you could go, like podcasts and Facebook groups and TikTok hashtags and things like that to find like-minded people or people who were having the same conversation around, deconstruction, as it's become called. And then the last thing is that we're also living in a time when the country's becoming increasingly secular on the whole. This is not just happening in evangelicalism, not by a long shot. And so I think not everyone who leaves church is becoming an atheist. Not that I'm criticizing atheists, especially friendly ones, but not everybody is totally giving up any kind of identification with religion or God or spirituality, but people are becoming less likely to affiliate with religious institutions. And so I think all of those things have kind of happened in tandem with one another. And that, again, has catalyzed what feels to me like kind of a new conversation over the last 8 years or so.
In your experience, have more people walked away from evangelical Christianity as a label anyway? Like you said, many of them are not leaving religion. They might believe in something supernatural still. But are they leaving because they just... whatever their experiences have been, they no longer believe? Is it because of LGBTQ issues? Is it because of abortion, like the culture war battles? What are the other reasons besides those? First, I'm wondering which of those you think weighs more on them. Is it culture war issues that they happen to disagree with? Or is it that they just no longer believe in the specifics of that culture they grew up with? And the second thing is, what are the reasons people are walking away from at least the label of evangelical Christianity?
I mean, the reasons are varied and they depend on the individual. And my book is kind of organized around various themes, LGBTQ issues, sexuality in general, politics, science, and a variety of other sort of, to what I call tension points that for a lot of people led to rethinking where they were at religiously or spiritually. There's been some new data that's come out even since I finished the book, and that's very interesting. Public Religion Research Institute has some data that suggests that one of the biggest factors is, and this is true for evangelicalism, but also other faith groups, is the view of LGBTQ people. This is a major factor, particularly for younger people who are disaffiliating from religion. A lot of people, yes, they simply say they don't believe in key aspects of what their religion teaches, and I don't think the data I've seen gets more fine grained than that. I don't know what exactly it is that doesn't line up, but the theology doesn't line up anymore. And another interesting data point I saw yesterday from Public Religion Research Institute, white evangelicals in particular are very likely to say that they felt that that staying in their churches was damaging to their mental health. So that, there's also just a sense that it's not an environment that feels healthy for people in many cases.
I have to think pastors of those larger evangelical churches are certainly aware of all these trends because they're not really new. Have you found them, are most of them putting blinders on and just going about their business, or are they trying to address the reasons people are walking away?
From what I've seen, some are and some aren't. I mean, my reporting focuses more on the people who walk away than on the pastors, but I do talk about some of the responses. There are those who have talked about the need to listen and try to understand, like Russell Moore, formerly with the Southern Baptist Convention. He's been a prominent critic of Donald Trump. He's very theologically conservative, still evangelical, but he has written and talked publicly about sort of the importance of listening to the critique from the Exvangelicals and trying to understand what that's about. But then there are other pastors who've publicly, and I write about this, publicly pushed back and quite vocally critiqued the deconstruction movement, and suggested that it's about wanting to sin or wanting to be cool, or something like that. And I think for a lot of people who have gone through this process of rethinking their belief system, hearing those sorts of things is pretty painful, particularly for people who, are LGBTQ and are not accepted in evangelical spaces. It's sort of,
It's
especially
always
especially those who've tried to retain a relationship to their faith, but again, it depends on the individual.
It's always interesting when you have in your mind a very legitimate reason for walking away from your church, but the stereotype of why you walked away, you're a sinner, you just want to do XYZ. It's like, that's not why, and that's why I can't take this criticism seriously then. Um, this is a separate point, but along the same lines, there are no churches for former Christians, but there are communities for people who left various religious groups. And I'm wondering, when it comes to deconstruction, when it comes to chatting with evangelicals, what is your media diet? Where do you get in touch with these people? What do you look at for people when it comes to trying to figure out, okay, this is what the trends are, this is what they're saying? Which sites are you looking at? You mentioned a lot of books in your book, you cite a lot of other authors, but I'm curious if there are other sites or other forums you visit regularly these days.
Yeah, I mean, I spend a lot of time just on social media spaces. So there are several Facebook groups that I pay attention to. I did a lot of just searching the hashtag Exvangelical or deconstruction on TikTok. That hashtag had, I think, over 1 billion views more than a year ago. TikTok has stopped sharing their impression data in the same way that they used to. But I would look around, and I've reached out to influencers who are talking and writing about these themes on various platforms. There are a lot of podcasts that are dealing with these themes. Some of them are mentioned at the end of the book. And then, yes, as you mentioned, I've interviewed other writers. There are people on Substack who are talking about many of these issues. I just kind of, I first heard the term exvangelical from someone we interviewed for a story in 2016 about evangelical women and the way that they were responding to the Access Hollywood video release. And one of the people we interviewed said, some of us are now using the term exvangelical because the term evangelical feels just too aligned with something political that we don't want to be a part of. And so that was kind of what sent me on this journey of just paying attention on TikTok, on Twitter, on Facebook, and elsewhere. Reddit, there's a Reddit community for evangelicals. And then, there are related terms like deconstruction and ex-Christian, which again, not all ex-evangelicals are ex-Christians. Some are not. And so, for the book, I wanted the story to really be a combination of my story in conversation with other people's stories. And so, I interviewed high-profile influencers, and I interviewed less high-profile people who were just saying interesting things in some of these spaces. And then I, pulled together a lot of data to try to get a handle on kind of what was happening.
I'm curious what you mentioned shiny happy people earlier. We've seen several of these docuseries that talk about the Duggars, the evangelical world, purity culture, all that stuff. Pray Away, talking about conversion therapy, things like that. What do you find do you find those to be useful, powerful? Do you find them accurate in describing the environment you grew up in, or are they unfair? And do you think those are playing an increasingly bigger role in helping people realize, like, okay, I'm not alone in my thinking on this stuff?
I mean, I think they're fascinating. I can't, in a broad way assess the accuracy of a whole group of different products. I mean, shiny happy people, I recognized parts of it because my a former spouse was deeply involved in the ATI Bill Gothard movement, and so I knew a lot of those kinds of stories secondhand. My church that I grew up in was also kind of went through a Bill Gothard phase, and I was not as deeply influenced as some as people in those who were profiled in that documentary specifically.
That sounds horrifying, a Bill Gothard phase.
Yeah, well, it was. My church, just to give you a sense of my church, it was a charismatic, non-denominational church. So it was not affiliated with a specific denomination like Assemblies of God, but it was kind of like Assemblies of God or Pentecostal in flavor. So like people raising their hands, speaking in tongues, praying for miracles, that kind of thing. And it was, sort of just a normal non-denominational church. And then a couple of the parents got very interested in Bill Gothard's work. I'm not sure how. And everybody started going to these seminars, like for at least couple of years in a row. I had to go to them at the end of my school day. And then before that time, I think we'd had a pretty conservative view about dating, like that it should be supervised and, you shouldn't get too serious in high school, that kind of thing. But suddenly everyone was talking about courtship and, just this idea that is sort of described in that documentary that, not only do you not have premarital sex, but you really don't date in a serious way. You kind of like almost have an arranged relationship with somebody where you're setting out to get married, from the get-go, and it's very hard to break it off and so forth. And so that thinking started to permeate a lot, not everybody, but a lot of people in my church and my youth group. And so,
You spend a lot of time in the book talking about Joshua Harris and his journey in
right,
kind of leading that movement, then stepping away from that movement, and then
right,
trying to make money off of stepping away from that movement.
right. The purity movement. And like everything, there is a spectrum, right? And so some people were more hardcore than others, but I think that what those documentaries do is they kind of provide a window into what these worlds can be like. When you're talking about a movement, white evangelicalism, that affected close to 1 in 4 people in the 1990s, there, again, I can't say enough how there's a huge spectrum. And that, to be fair, that is like the more extreme end of the spectrum, but it influenced the way that a lot of people thought in more mainstream churches as well.
I want to ask you about a political question, and I'm not asking for your opinion because I think that would be unfair since you are a reporter, but I am wondering, having someone like Mike Johnson as Speaker of the House, who is, no doubt he is a conservative Christian and evangelical, I'm wondering if it helps or hurts the evangelical church writ large to have someone like him in such a high position of power. Because, in one sense, you could say, yeah, this is a guy who is one of us and he's in the spotlight. On the other side, I think I could personally say, yeah, but he's not a good look for the church. And if that's the guy you're putting front and center, I could see more people saying, you know what, I don't want to be part of this anymore. And I don't know if you've spoken to people who are in the evangelical world about this or who have left or something, but I'm wondering, when you have not Trump, but high profile evangelical Christians doing in those positions of power, is that a good thing or a bad thing for the church, for the evangelical church?
I'm not sure I have a view on that. It depends on what you mean by a good thing. It depends on what the objective is.
That's fair. I'm wondering, one thing as a reporter, you have to be a fact checker. You can't just take things on hunches. That contradicts what many people are taught as believers, where you're supposed to take things on faith. I'm wondering, what advice would you give to believers, to churches, to the congregations you grew up with, when it comes to critical thinking, when it comes to fact checking things that they believe? You've had those two worlds coincide for a lot of your career. What have you learned about that when it comes to taking something on faith and then, doing the fact checking you need to do?
I think faith and journalism have really different purposes, and I wouldn't apply the same metrics or approaches to those two things. Journalism is about fundamentally sort of describing what's happening and documenting history, holding the powerful to account. Faith and religion are about something else. I mean, I think they are at their best about community and meaning and purpose. And I would not give advice to churches. That's just not what I do as a journalist at all. But I guess what I would say about my own view of that is that I think the people I admire the most who are spiritual or religious people are those who have found a way to be, both thoughtful, moral, considered people about, trying to live in this world in the best way they can, honor their tradition, whatever that may be, or their spiritual practice, whatever that may be, while also being reasoned, thinking people, And so for that reason, I think back to some of my professors that, did have a deep faith and to whom their faith meant a lot, but also were sensitive to reason and were willing to be honest with me about what they did and didn't know and what they could and couldn't assert. And I think that that's, in a way, that's just about humility, intellectual humility, not overstating what you do and don't know. So maybe I'm answering your question after all. I mean, I think maybe the through line there is about intellectual humility.
No, that makes sense. There is a question that one person is asking. I like this one. How do you deal with people who may have read your book and say, well, you were never really a Christian after all, if you're walking away from many of the elements of it, the whole no true Scotsman idea? Have you gotten that criticism so far from the book?
I've been really surprised how little criticism I've gotten. I was expecting more, to be honest. And I think for those who've read the book, it's not a screed. It is not a diatribe. It is not like there's no effort to tell anybody what to think. I became a journalist partly because I don't have any interest in that, but I do have an interest in telling the truth as I see it and accurately describing the way that I and others have experienced the world. And so, maybe that criticism will come. It wouldn't surprise me if it does. I think, when you say something like you were never a true Christian, well, what does that even mean? I mean, who is a true Christian and by what standard and what's your definition? And I think if you read the book, I hope it comes across that I was deeply and sincerely grappling with my Christian faith, cared a lot about it. Wanted to share it with other people, wanted to do the right thing, wanted to please God. And I'm still concerned with trying to do the right thing as much as I can and trying to understand what's true and what's real. And so, I think that's an easy move for someone who maybe is in a different place than where I am and doesn't and might be uncomfortable with where I am. But I think it's unfair. But again, I haven't really heard that yet. So
I'm glad you haven't. In your reporting when talking to Exvangelicals, is there anything they've said to you at any point that was not evident to you through your own experiences? Anything that surprised you that you're like, wow, that's a thought I never had, even though I'm going down a similar path?
I mean, I think there's nothing that jumps out at me. I think in some ways I was probably most interested, or the most different experience was some of the men I talked to, who had, could kind of talk about growing up in purity culture from a male point of view. We talk a lot about how purity culture can be harmful for women and girls. And I think that's very true. There's like an emphasis on covering up and not tempting men, and this idea that it's, really kind of the woman's responsibility to put on the brakes in a sexual relationship. But I think that one of the things that I understand from talking to men from this background as well is that a lot of men have also struggled with these ideas. There's a lot of pressure on both men and women at a young age to be very mature, to have life figured out, because you can't have sex until you get married, and you can't get married until you're ready to be an adult. And so there can be a tendency to sort of rush everything. And I think that puts different pressures on men and women. Men are kind of expected to be like this big patriarch, which is hard to do when you're like 22 years old,
And
you know?
like you're saying, there's just the switch that goes on. You're not supposed to think about that stuff at all. And then the second you get married, everything's supposed to be perfect. And of
Yeah,
course, that's not
which
how
is
it
not
works.
realistic.
Right.
Right, right.
This is a question. Sarah, what denomination were you in, and did they use hell to keep people from leaving? Did hell make it any harder for you to leave? I'm not sure what your thoughts are about hell these
Oh,
days.
yeah. The
Thank you for
idea,
that, Guitar Dog.
yeah, the idea of hell was very, very central. It was very real. It was very literal. I was terrified of it. I think it's a very powerful and frightening idea, obviously. What denomination was I again, I was non-denominational. So the church I was part of was kind of there were, actually don't go into this in the book, but for part of my childhood, I was part of one church, and then it planted a sister church like 20 minutes away. They were, the same church, but different locations. And I just don't go into that, because who cares? But again, it was charismatic. So like speaking in tongues, raising hands. The Christian school that I went to, the K-12 school, was not charismatic. So nobody would speak in tongues. Nobody would raise their hands. It was a little more buttoned down, kind of more like Baptist in flavor, but also an independent, really a little bit more fundamentalist in style and aesthetic. And then the college I went to was an evangelical free college. So, and again, I think it's important to understand how much these ideas and movements and subsets cross-pollinate, intersect, overlap. There are different like streams of theology and practice, but conservative Christianity it kind of has like a shared subculture, and some of it influences Catholic churches as well. But yeah, that was my experience.
This is a question about journalism in general, but I know it's really hard. A lot of newspapers are dying out. They don't have a lot of journalists, period, much less religion focused journalists. But I'm wondering, in your experience, what do journalists tend to get wrong when they cover evangelicals, when they cover the church? Maybe you can answer that when you were part of it versus, things they tend to get wrong now that you've been on both sides of that fence.
I think sometimes there's a tendency to talk about just evangelical leadership and sort of allied to the fact that it is such a big group of people, and there are differences of opinion, and there is a spectrum. I mean, at the same time, 8 out of 10 white evangelicals supported Trump in the last 2 elections, and white evangelicals have been hugely influential in making Trump the presumptive nominee again this year. So there is, I think there's a fair amount of consensus, but it's not a monolith like any large group of people. And that's part of why I wanted to write the book, because I was seeing dissent, and I was seeing, critique from within the family. And I think it's important to talk about that.
One question, there was something I read in your book that stood out to me. I'm curious if you can talk about this. You mentioned that one of the evangelicals you spoke to, you met him in an online support group for people struggling with loved ones who are caught in a swirl of misinformation. And I found that interesting. Like, how much of an issue has that been for you? And I'm wondering, was that misinformation political, or was it faith-based and then political? Like, what has that been like for you to deal with?
Yeah, a lot of it was, I was doing reporting on after January 6th on sort of extremism and misinformation, and a lot of it was people who were into QAnon or things like that. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that there is some data, researchers like Ruth Brownstein at the University of Connecticut and others have looked closely at sort of uptake of misinformation and conspiracy theories and the relationship or the correlation with religious belief, and have found that by sort of crunching the numbers, that white evangelicals appear to be more susceptible to certain types of misinformation, things like QAnon and related ideas. We also saw with the COVID pandemic, and I did some reporting on this, that white evangelicals were the religious group that was least willing to get vaccines early on. And, I have to say that some evangelical leaders like Franklin Graham, the son of the late Reverend Billy Graham, who is very conservative and a Trump supporter, but Franklin Graham, came out and encouraged evangelicals to get the vaccine, because I think it was the numbers were looking so bad. And, one of the things that appears to be true to me is that evangelicals for a long time have been skeptical of secular authority in many cases. And I think some of it probably ties in with the longstanding, decades long resistance to evolutionary theory that I've talked about. And so there's this idea that science might mislead you. Scientists might want to mislead you, and that secular authorities are not to be trusted, and that religious authorities are paramount. And so, and again, this doesn't apply to everyone, but when you approach epistemology in that way, it seems to me that there is a greater susceptibility to, refusing to accept things like vaccine science and virology, epidemiology.
Purely a hypothetical question, but I've thought about it a lot because we've seen so many white evangelical leaders do the whole vaccine denial thing for the reasons you mentioned. This is rhetorical as much as anything else, but I'm wondering if COVID happened during, say, the George W. Bush administration and not Donald Trump's, I wonder if white evangelicals and their leaders would not have been as anti-vax. Like, they've always kind of been skeptical of science for the reasons you mentioned. And I wonder if they would have opposed the vaccine in the numbers they seem to be doing now if it happened, not under Donald Trump. Or was that mixture? Did Trump push them into overdrive on this very science-based thing?
I mean, I thought it was kind of surprising because Trump was in charge at the time that the vaccine was being developed. So,
he could have taken credit for it and just told everyone to do it.
But, he didn't tell people not to do it. I mean, I don't know. And like I said, you had prominent leaders like Franklin Graham telling people, get the vaccine, love your neighbor, get the vaccine. And so I think, I don't know.
I'm sorry, I want to, Franklin Graham told people to get the vaccine, or did he shift on that later?
No, he told people to get the vaccine.
Okay.
Yes. I did a story about it for NPR. And so, I don't know. I think some of it also might be sort of a skepticism of government, skepticism of, public health authorities. It's a good question. It's an interesting question.
One last question for you here. I'm wondering, in your experience, or at least with the Exvangelicals you have spoken to, are there certain elements of the faith that seem hardest for people to let go of? Not about God per se, but I'm wondering, is abortion, LGBTQ issues, evolution, are there elements of it? I mean, you talked about how, you came to realize the science side of things at some point here, and that was something you grappled with and you dealt with that. But are there aspects of evangelical culture that they just have a hard time letting go of, even if they don't consider themselves evangelical anymore?
Definitely the community. I mean, I think that's one of the things that keeps people in religious groups, and one of the most positive things based on research about being in religious groups is the sense of community. Now, sometimes that community can be very exclusive of people who are different, and sometimes those who are included are a very a narrow group of people. But for those who do feel like they're part of it, that sense of identity, kind of knowing who you're who your people are is really powerful. You know, there was a tweet that kind of became memeified a couple months ago of a person who had left evangelicalism, and they said, you know, a few years ago when I was a member of a church and I needed to move, I had 20 people show up at my door and help me move boxes. Today, my husband and I are moving and there was no one. And, you know, that is one of the really sad things about it. It's hard to replace that. And, you know, people I talked to replaced it in different ways, some by simply going to a different religious community, others by finding it, you know, sort of informally or through the idea of chosen family. But that is, I think, one of the most powerful things that religion often provides for people.
That is also what I've found with a lot of atheists who, even if they don't believe anymore, they may still want to stick around their church community for exactly that reason. There is no social safety net waiting for them on the other side, and that's a hard change for anyone to deal with. Well, with that said, Sarah McCammon, the new book is called The Exvangelicals: Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. It's a really interesting look at this movement that is not stopping anytime soon. I found it interesting. I think others will too. Any final words on your end?
No, I hope that, I really wrote the book for people who had experiences leaving a religious community and struggled with it, or wanted to, you know, feel less alone. I hope it will. I've heard from a lot of people who said they felt less alone after reading it. I also wrote it for people who are really confused by evangelicalism and trying to make sense of it, and the culture behind it, and the politics around it. And I have also heard from people who've said, you know, after reading this, it really paints a picture of that world for me, and I feel like I get it. And so I hope that people who fall into either category will read it and find it, you know, helpful and informative. So Thank you for
Absolutely.
your time.
Yeah, thank you. And it was very informative. So thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for asking questions and joining into the live chat. And thank you, Sarah. See you all
Appreciate it.
later.
Take care.